Okay, I think we are about ready to begin our activity today. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and welcome to our conversation on AI's impact on firms and their talent and augmenting talent from within. Delighted to welcome you here and delighted to welcome an amazing group of panelists to participate in our conversation. My name is Dan Koloski, and I'll serve as our moderator today. I am a professor of practice at Northeastern University. I teach in analytics and information systems, mostly with a focus on the applicability of AI and analytics to business. And I spent most of my career in the enterprise software field. I'm joined here by really a wonderful group of people, Tom Davenport, Chris Torina, and Berkeley Almand-Hunter. I'll introduce each of these folks as we get into our conversation today. And I hope you enjoy hearing from them as much as I enjoy hearing from them. Really what our goal today is to talk about, AI continues to be a really interesting opportunity for enterprises and the human capital within enterprises to build new value, to create new value, to build new opportunities. And yet at the same time, we hear a lot of skepticism around sort of what's really delivering value to firms. Where really is the ROI? Where are people investing and actually achieving outcomes that they're after? We know that the level of investment at the moment is incredibly high, especially in the creation of new data centers, but also in terms of firm and board and C-suite and leadership level mindshare in terms of thinking about how to take advantage of this opportunity, how not to sort of lose ground and get behind, but also to deliver value to the firm ultimately. And so we're going to use this conversation today to explore some of these issues. In terms of housekeeping, there is a Q&A tab available as part of the webinar. We encourage you to submit questions. We will try to look at those and answer those as we go through toward the end of the presentation today. And we would love to hear from you and hear what's top of mind for you, which will help us deliver the most value to you as a part of this. So for starters, we're going to open with a kind of view of AI's place in the firm and the opportunities for sort of companies to take advantage of the opportunity. And for here, I'm going to welcome someone who I'm personally a big fan of, Dr. Tom Davenport. Tom is the President's Distinguished Professor of Information Technology and Management, as well as the Faculty Director for the Metropolis Institute for Technology and Entrepreneurship at Babson College. He's also a Fellow of the MIT Initiative for the Digital Economy. He's written and edited 26 books and over 300 print and digital articles for a wide variety of outlets, inclusive of Harvard Business Review, the Sloan Management Review, Financial Times, and many others. He's written actually among those books is what I view as one of the seminal books in the field of analytics, competing on analytics, which I teach in my own courses. So it really is an honor to have Tom here today. He teaches or has taught, besides at Babson, at Harvard Business School, University of Chicago, Tuck, and Darden School of Business, and a number of others. So Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. We're delighted to have you. And let me open with a question to kind of get the conversation started. So today's conversation really is focused around AI, and that's the conversation that many firms are having. But before we got to today's conversation, you were already a leader, as I'd mentioned, in advising on firm competitiveness in the area of analytics and sort of build firm capability there. So maybe we can just start sort of thinking about the through line between when you were working with firms as we evangelize the field of analytics and today. What is the same about the opportunity? What's different about the opportunity for firms as they think about the opportunity to sort of up-level their competitiveness in the world of AI versus the world of analytics that you've been talking about for a bit longer?
Well, Dan, you can't even mention the word analytics anymore. It's going to make our attendees' numbers drop immediately because it's all AI now. But, those in the know, I think, are aware that at least the predictive analytics form of the concept is remarkably similar to certain types of machine learning. In fact, I would argue it's basically the same as the more rudimentary forms of machine learning involving, logistic regression algorithms and things like that. So it hasn't gone away, and I've made it part of my personal crusade to try not to let people forget about what I call analytical AI. I don't know. I hated those terms like traditional AI or legacy AI or the old form of AI. But it's AI designed to predict the future from data from the past, and that's still a really useful thing for anybody wanting to make better decisions. And I think in many cases, I was actually talking to a big Asian bank about the economics of AI a couple of evenings ago, and they said, well, we of course use generative AI, but we think we generally get more value out of analytical AI because we use it in credit and fraud and various other places around the bank, and it's just more tied to the value that we get. So I try really hard to get people not to forget that and to use it as much as possible for making better decisions.
So one aspect of AI is the opportunity to make better decisions through better analysis and similar, but it has a whole other set of opportunity areas for companies. And maybe just how are you observing people thinking about the use of AI, both sort of at the individual level for sort of individual practitioners, but then sort of at the more enterprise level for companies? Where are they spending their time? Where are the sweet spots for people to focus on?
Well, I think both are important, but I think if you really care about measurable value, particularly from generative AI, you'll be a lot more successful if you take an enterprise-oriented approach, or, not necessarily for your entire enterprise, but something bigger than the individual, maybe an entire business function or an entire cross-functional process or something along those lines. I think what a number of companies have found, I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review about this a couple of weeks ago with a couple of Stanford researchers. What a lot of companies have found is, it's great to have people do their emails faster and their blog posts faster and their product descriptions and so on with generative AI, but it's really hard to measure the productivity gains from that. And, some say, well, even if they aggregate it, they say, well, we saved 1 million minutes this year, but what are those minutes used for? Nobody has a clue. Did people go home early? Did they, check out TikTok? Whatever. So I think those more enterprise-oriented applications are more likely to create value for organizations. And you've seen companies like Johnson & Johnson and Coca-Cola and so on saying, we're not going to give up on the individual ones. We think this bank that I was talking to said that's important for us, even from a employee satisfaction and retention perspective, even though, we can't measure the economic value very easily. But only a small portion, I think, of those will become kind of get promoted up to be an enterprise priority. It is important, I think, to have bottom-up innovation as well, but I think most of the value is going to come from the more high-level applications.
That's a really interesting point, that if we don't think intentionally how to monetize the productivity gains, whether they're at the individual level and sort of aggregated across employees, or through an enterprise app that changes a workflow or fundamentally sort of alters the way we do business. But if we don't think intentionally about how to utilize the productivity gains, maybe they go off into sort of non-value generating areas, which is a really interesting concept. What are you seeing in the use of AI hooked up to automation through either agentic scenarios or similar? Are people actually doing it, or is it more just talk at this point?
Well, there's certainly a lot of talk. Agent washing, I think, is the term du jour for every vendor. I think a number of companies are doing something with it, but it tends still to be more internal, back office-ish kinds of things, not anything that involves large-scale financial transactions. Still requiring, even with the internal applications, still requiring a human in the loop in many cases. Still a lot of pilots, not that many production deployments. So much more talk than action, I would say. And if you look at some of the analyses that have been done by companies, including vendors, that you probably read about that Anthropic store that they had in the bottom of their headquarters, in the lobby of their headquarters building, that was giving away stuff to people for free and giving them lower prices if they were nice and so on. There was a Carnegie Mellon study saying that only about 24% of transactions got done correctly. So I just don't think we're there yet fully, although I think we will be, and I think it's important to get ready to do the pilots to start to prepare.
And so when you think about areas that are delivering value, at the moment there's a fair amount in the press questioning ROI. There's a fair amount in the press questioning, are the productivity gains real, or are they just sort of washing, to use a similar term? From your perspective, are we seeing unnecessary hype? And if so, where is the real value showing up that you've observed in firms?
Yes, I think there is too much hype about generative AI, which it's understandable because anybody can use it quite easily, which wasn't true of the more analytical approaches to AI. You had to kind of understand statistics to do it well. And B, the generative AI is kind of coming for the chattering classes. The knowledge work content producers, and that of course is going to mean that a lot of things get written about it. But I do think that there's value in targeted kind of internal knowledge access and distribution applications, not for the entire enterprise in most cases, but obviously customer service I think has a lot of potential benefits from this. I've been doing some research on how customers manage market and customer insights. And years ago, I did some work with Procter & Gamble, and this guy said, "Yeah, I own the key to the room where we keep all our old market research studies." And so every once in a while, I go into that room and see if there are any footprints in the dust other than mine, and there never are. But we can make all that knowledge quite easily available with generative AI related tools. So I think as long as it's targeted with a certain amount of business value anticipated from it, using your own content as opposed to the generic content in standard language models, I think you can get a whole lot of value out of it.
That's great. That's great. And Tom, we're going to come back to you as we sort of consider some of the meta questions around this, but that's a great segue over to Chris, because what Tom's referring to is, how do we change organizational behavior and internal activities that may essentially turn old assets, using sort of the market research closet example, into new assets using AI, right? That requires sort of a rethinking of sort of an entrepreneurial approach inside the companies. So let me just tell you all a second about Chris. So Chris is our director here at the Roux Institute of Entrepreneurship, focused on advancing and strengthening the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in our state of Maine. But previous to his time with us, Chris was founder and CEO of DeepStacks, which is one of the world's leading gaming entertainment brands, ultimately acquired by the World Poker Tour. Some of you probably have heard of. As well as the chief operating officer at Blue Fusion Capital, which is a private equity firm focused in the real estate area. And before that, has a really interesting career in law enforcement as an undercover narcotics agent and SWAT team operator. So Chris brings a really interesting breadth of experience this time here with us at the Roux, and he's helping firms really generate essentially net new opportunities. So Chris, you work a lot with sort of big firms as well as small startups that are aspiring to be more innovative. AI represents an opportunity to do so using sort of the example that Tom was talking about sort of repurposing old assets or deploying sort of targeted energy in certain ways. So what are the approaches that you've seen that are most effective for firms that are saying, great, we've got an opportunity. How do we sort of revitalize our internal activities to bring sort of an entrepreneurial point of view to our activities? What are you seeing?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. I think, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I think people kind of tagged innovation to be more entrepreneurial in terms of, how entrepreneurs or startups are a little bit more nimble and flexible and willing to pivot. And I think what we've seen over the last several years is these larger firms, larger organizations adopting that mindset, where they're having to see sort of market conditions and how maybe their competitors are behaving in the innovation space. So the things that we're seeing large organizations do that are really great approaches is really treating innovation not as this weird side project, but more of like a structured, intentional aspect of their business, maybe not their core business, but something that impacts their core business. So two examples that come to mind are the Avangrid Energy Corp, which we work closely with. They have a designated innovation group within their org that basically focuses on things that are centric to their core business, but then also to their sister companies, whether that's data storage, technologies, or energy safety, sort of enhancing their line operations from a workforce development perspective. But then we also have groups like Graybar, which is a very large electrical supply or electrical equipment supplier that have a core of employees that are seeing challenges that they're facing on a day-to-day basis within their organizations in their normal sort of day-to-day workflow that they're now sort of tackling using entrepreneurship design thinking to sort of provide solutions that impact their core business. So it's really transformational what we're seeing. And many of the most successful firms are establishing actual internal innovation labs, venture studios, or even like propping up pilot programs that we, as the Roux, tend to sort of support or facilitate on behalf of the larger organization. But I think the key part of that is really having leadership buy in and the willingness to embrace that experimentation without abandoning the stability of their workforce and really their core business. And I think there are measurable outcomes that we could look back in terms of our work with these small and large firms, whether it's revenue diversification or efficiency gains or really sort of talent retention, which is really a big part of it.
So it's finding the balance between between the external forcing function, excuse me, I'm mute for 1 second. Well, that was unusual. Finding the balance between the external forcing function of the innovation energy, but not having it be a bolt-on to the core activities, instead be sort of an intentional part of the bloodline of those core activities. It sounds like what you're saying, which intuitively makes sense, but in practice can be very hard to do. So what are the barriers to actually doing that that firms have to overcome when they want to make this an intentional part of diversifying their core business, but not necessarily the core business?
Yeah, great question. I think it's more cultural than technical, right? So I think when you think about how traditional organizations or organizations that really haven't thought about innovation as something that is core to their business or could impact their core business, I think you think about legacy processes, rigid hierarchies, and sort of this risk aversion, right? As entrepreneurs, we see day to day here at the Roux between our accelerators, our incubators, and our community programs, where our entrepreneurs, our founders are not risk averse. Like they know they have to take that next step. So, that tends to suppress creativity in a larger organization. So we have to work intentionally with the organizations and our customers to sort of break that barrier. Because at the end of the day, many of the employees have really great ideas, but in some cases, they don't feel empowered or supported to test them, get into that experimentation. So what we suggest firms consider is obviously a mindset shift. That's core. But also sort of creating these safe spaces for their employees to develop these ideas that can be shared and tested without fear of failure, right? Like, I think that once you break that down, it creates this like really catalyzing environment for innovation to grow and to sort of, scale. And we encourage firms to also celebrate that learning, not just from outcomes. I think we tend to see with larger firms like everything's baked into impact and numbers and bottom line, but really sort of we try to have them think about, hey, we do need to celebrate your workforce sort of thinking differently and approaching the challenges that they're facing every day with entrepreneurship design thinking. And that really sort of what breeds innovation internally.
So just as Tom was saying, in the AI opportunity, we want to have targeted activities that we can point to, a fail fast, MVP sort of type of mindset here can help firms, especially if they provide the opportunity to fail in a safe way.
Yeah, because I mean, they need to come to terms with the fact that by driving towards innovation, you are going to learn more by failing initially than by succeeding, right? Like that is what in my experience, having had my venture, I can look back 15 years later or 10 years later and say, wow, I would not change a thing because I failed at those critical points, those inflection points of my business. And that's sort of the message that we try to share with the firms as they're thinking about a venture studio or innovation lab, or even engaging with us on a workforce development project. So that's something of a mind shift.
So good segue, because the way this is ultimately going to get operationalized in the firm is through the people, right? Through the employees, whether it's the achievement of AI-enabled initiatives or individual productivity or running these experiments, failing quickly and trying the next experiment. Let me turn to you, Berkeley, and tell everybody about Berkeley for a second. So Dr. Berkeley Almand-Hunter is our technical director of partner products here at Northeastern's Roux Institute. She's a lecturer in analytics as well in our College of Professional Studies, focused largely on helping partners mature their workforces. Prior to her time with us, she was data scientist at Square, which is now Block, I believe. And we're delighted to have Berkeley here. So Berkeley, since firm change ultimately is going to be executed by the employees at the firm, inclusive of the leaders, but also the middle managers and individual contributors, and even the entry-level employees, some of whom sometimes feel like getting left out of this conversation. Could you talk a little bit about sort of your point of view of the ecosystem of roles that these folks can play in and around these AI and data-centric opportunities and how they can participate?
Sure. Yeah. So every company has different titles for different roles, but we believe that you can sort of put everybody into one of 5 buckets. So one group is your senior leaders, and they need to be able to drive AI initiatives and communicate the importance of them and responsibility to the rest of the company. You have your business partners, and this group isn't as defined by their skill set as much as the fact that it's not their primary role to work with data. So they're going to work with the data teams and use the data that others produce to make decisions. So they need to be able to communicate really well with the data teams. They need to be able to, tell compelling data stories to drive change in the organization. The next group is curators, and it's important to remember that anyone can be a curator when they're inputting data into a system. So it's important to think about who all is doing that in your company. But we're typically thinking here of data engineers, people who are responsible for data storage and getting data through ETLs and similar things to places that people can access it, which is still super critical for AI. I mean, everyone thinks that AI is going to wave a magic wand, but it's critical to have reliable, accessible data. The next group is your practitioners. These are the people you probably think of as the data people. Their title might be, analyst, data scientist, AI engineer, actuary. But there are actually a lot of people in companies who don't have a data title, but become the data person on their team. It just happens organically because they're good at it and they're interested. So we always try to identify those people when we're doing upskilling as well. And then finally, we have data citizens, which is everyone. And we, like Tom, believe that basic analytics and data literacy are super important. So everybody needs some of that, and also just basic Gen AI prompting skills.
And so when we think about the broad democratized access to this technology, whether it's the fact that chatbots are sort of ubiquitously available, or that analytics capability is now built into sort of systems of record software that many people are using, how do we get people comfortable operating in these environments? What are the experiences ultimately that change behavior for employees in a firm?
Yeah, so we strongly believe in experiential education. When people are doing a course and working on their company's data, their problems, they'll be much more engaged and find the work much more applicable to their job. And that's one of our driving metrics in the courses that we do. We ask everyone after every class, is this going to make you better at your job? And around 80% of people say yes. And we think that's because of the experiential education, but also because of our role-based pathways. So we're putting people into courses that are actually relevant to them, which is why we think about these data roles in the first place. And what course is relevant to you depends on what you do all day.
So roles-based pathway will vary with, company context and the placement of that individual in the company's context as they start to try to roll out their AI-centric opportunities. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Great. So, so when we think about the use of AI, another conversation that's coming up with a lot of our partners, and I'm going to open this question to everybody, but Berkeley, maybe we can start with you while you have the mic. We're hearing a lot of questions from folks about energy usage associated with AI, and questions around, how do I understand that? How do I think about that in the company? Today it's hidden from us in many cases, but how does this come up in the context of sort of training employees and their behavior with use of AI? Berkeley, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so a lot of people are concerned about this, including me. I think there are a few different things you can do. So I think the biggest thing, which is also just strategically smart, is to ask yourself, do I need generative AI for this problem? Is this really a better analytics problem or traditional machine learning problem? And then once you've identified that, yes, this is the best solution for the problem, there's a few things you can do. So at an enterprise scale, if you are implementing a solution, you can consider using smaller language models that are fine-tuned to a specific use case somewhere in your workflow, whether you're calling it an agentic workflow or not. And you can also just shop for providers that publish sustainability reports, et cetera. And then I think on an individual level, there are a couple little things you can do. I have the AI search turned off on my Google search for a couple reasons. So one, I don't usually need it. I just want to know what time the coffee shop opens, and I don't need a Gen AI answer for that. And secondly, I'm not going to ask a question the same way to Google as I am to ChatGPT. So it doesn't really make sense to have it turned on in Google anyway for me. And I'm really careful about image generation because that uses a lot more electricity. So if you're going to do that, you do some things to be really careful about how you do it and how many images you generate.
Let's pull that concept out sort of at the macro level. Tom, when you're working with firms and they're choosing among AI areas to focus on, how are they thinking about managing the visible but also hidden costs associated with using AI for particular sort of business problems?
Well, sadly, I don't think it comes up much. As you said, it's not terribly visible to the user how much their prompt, their session is costing, and how much energy it's using, and so on. We really only see it in the aggregate when OpenAI says they're going to need 250 gigawatts of data center power, and which is, by the way, about 20% of what the entire United States uses on an average day. So I think there's probably needs to be a reckoning about that at some point. I agree with Berkeley, I wrote an article recently about using small language models, and then one year or two ago about how to make generative AI greener. And I think we're starting to realize that the bigger the model doesn't necessarily mean the better the answer. And several of us said we should have these more focused use cases, and in many cases those can be done with smaller models.
So smaller, more targeted, more intentional use not only sort of serves a business value, but actually also can serve sort of this environmental and economic cost value on an ongoing basis, which is great. Chris, let's just sort of dovetail that toward the entrepreneurial mindset or the intrapreneurial mindset in a firm. It sounds like there's a natural synergy here with encouraging people to both think innovatively but think pragmatically in a resource-constrained environment, taking some of the mindset that we use in entrepreneurship to apply to this case. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think, in some use cases here, I mean, we're such a dynamic, collaborative campus here up in Portland at the Roux that, you can have a more of an impactful sort of center of gravity conversation with one of our mentors and residents than maybe you get an output from a prompt in AI, right? Like the answers are existing with the humans that are working around you and the, the staff that we have around here. But, some of the workshops that we do around AI, the theme is like garbage in, garbage out. So one of the things that we offer is, sort of tips and tactics around, prompt engineering and sort of really great inputs to get the output. So really sort of, cycling that through to make sure that we're not wasting so much time on getting the perfect answer from AI, and really sort of trying to get the best output for the case at hand. So I think from what we try to tell people when they use AI or we have a climate tech incubator here. When you think about the impact to climate and environment, let's start with the human first, right? Let's start with the people that you're working around, and let's start with education, and then let's start to implement AI into that cycle. And that's some of the things that we found to be the most successful.
So that's a very novel idea, Chris, to actually talk to a human first.
I know. Could you believe it?
Sometimes the low tech approach can actually get us a great outcome. I totally agree.
I love Berkeley's analogy of the coffee shop, right? Like I don't need to ask Claude or Chat to give me a 5-year projection on, a new product or service. Like I might be able to find that answer in real time from someone here that we work around, or, one of my fellow colleagues. So I think having the human element with education then allows you to use a tactical tool like AI more effectively. And that's something that we find to be really a great approach as we think about how entrepreneurs engage with not just AI, but just emerging technologies in their growth journey.
That's great. And I see there's some comments on the chat coming in. One of them related to this energy conversation, saying that clients are expressing concern in terms of energy usage, not just for environmental reasons, but for getting locked into energy price, right? And again, that's hidden from us today, largely on the backs of venture funding, but at some point that bill is going to come due to the end consumer also. And when that query, instead of $20 a month, costs $2,000 to run, people may think twice about using it for frivolous or sort of unnecessary use cases. So let's talk about sort of how we think about necessary use cases. So again, we started earlier talking about the difference between using AI purely as an augmentation of a human in the loop decision, but also using AI as an automation solution, what people are referring to as agentic and related. So Tom, from your perspective, are there leadership decisions that you've seen for which AI plus automation is especially applicable, and what were the guardrails under which that was successful? Or is human in the loop still the most important aspect?
Well, I think in most cases, you still want a human in the loop, if nothing else, than to be monitoring, how's the automation solution working out, and has the world changed in such a way that it's not the best way to go about it anymore. AI in general is not a great tool for realizing that the world has changed since your model was created, and it's not the best, providing the best answer anymore. And so, but in general, I think when we automate, we sort of pour concrete around a certain way of doing business, even with AI, which can be certainly more flexible than more deterministic computing technologies. I think humans involved can just provide innovation in addition to the productivity and so on that automation provides. So in almost all cases, I think we're better off with a combination of the two.
That's great. That's great. And in fact, there was a question on the chat regarding human-centered AI. We do have a whole research arm at Northeastern focused on human-in-the-loop AI. It's a big piece of our research and learning agenda for the same reason, right? That automation sometimes can be very, very valuable, but to Tom's point, ensuring that we have not just accountability, but transparency for the use of AI, especially in decisioning, requires that we as humans and managers and business leaders stay in the loop. I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. We got a bunch of them coming in, and I see them now. Thank you for pointing those out to me, Julie. So there's a couple questions that have come up. Here's one, and I'll throw this out to all of us, although it was addressed first to Tom. So Tom, maybe you can start. Looking ahead, when you think about leadership competencies, what leadership competencies are going to be most important if and when a given AI begins to act as a sort of a semi-autonomous decision maker with its own purpose? What do we need to cultivate in our human leaders in order to coexist peacefully with a semi-autonomous agent?
Well, I think the big picture thinking, that is sort of looking at the world and seeing how it's changing and what that might mean for our AI capabilities. The same sort of critical thinking that's necessary for any user of generative AI, I think is quite important for leaders to say, does this make sense, and are we getting value, and so on. But the value management skills of measuring and experimenting and knowing when to move from pilots to production, I think are really quite important. One of the big problems we've had in AI value is this pilotitis phenomenon, where companies do lots and lots of pilots, but very few of them make it into production deployment. And that just doesn't create any economic. You may learn from it, which is important, but it doesn't necessarily create economic value.
Yep. There's a great question that came in. I wanted to give Chris a chance on this one. AI, a lot of what's in the press are going to be sort of headlines around big company use of AI. We got a whole team and we're transforming an enterprise workflow. But in the United States and really around the world, the lion's share of businesses are not massive enterprises. They're small and mid-sized businesses who may not have sort of these large-scale internal teams the way larger firms do. So how should small and mid-sized businesses be thinking about taking advantage of these capabilities, knowing that their context is going to be different than a larger firm?
Yeah, great question. I think smaller firms or medium-sized firms actually have the advantage over the larger orgs. I think from a flexibility and sort of nimbleness, they can deploy and test tools a little bit more rapidly and more impactful. But they're inherently closer to their customers, right? So when you're dealing with like a small business or a startup here, they are keeping their ear to the ground in terms of what their customers or potential customers are actually want, sort of what the market opportunity is there. So, they tend to, at least in my experience, analyze their customer data a little bit more efficiently, but they also use AI a little bit more strategically as it pertains to marketing and content creation. So like when I was coming up, we would have to hire either a fractional CMO or outsource to a third party to handle any sort of content creation. So we're, kind of getting more bang for our buck in terms of brand awareness and marketing campaign outreach. But now it's AI. Like AI can literally generate me an entire Instagram or TikTok campaign in the fraction of the time of a third party what could have done or a firm, 5 or 10 years ago. So I think from a nimbleness perspective, smaller firms tend to be a little bit more open-minded and more flexible, which then ultimately gets them to be a little bit more efficient in terms of, what their customers might want and sort of what future strategies might be long term.
I would also add, Chris, to that point that and this is true with large firms too, not everything needs to be built. Vendors are providing AI-enabled capabilities in a lot of the systems of record that many small firms now are almost entirely using third-party SaaS, software as a service, for their core business functions in terms of software consumption. They may not want to build AI. They might want to use the right-click AI provided by their vendors to augment workflows. Now, generally, you're not going to sort of bet the firm on those features that show up in vendor stacks, but it's a low barrier to entry for smaller firms to take advantage of some of these capabilities without necessarily turning it into an internal project. Another question that has come through is related to thinking about sort of complex end-to-end automation scenarios where maybe we're going to try to do sort of multi-agent type workflows. When we think about humans in the loop, and Berkeley, I'll throw this to you as we've had conversations around responsible AI and governance with many firms. How are we thinking about teaching people to understand the accountability that they need to hold for, again, complex sort of automated workflows relative to where the humans ought to be in the loop?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that if you map the workflow first, it will give you a good idea of the critical points. As Tom has said in the beginning, there's still a human in the loop in most of these scenarios. So you just need to remember that Gen AI hallucinates. I mean, there's a Sam Altman talk the other day where he was saying, oh, it's, it hallucinates like 30% of the time. I don't know why people trust it so much. So I think with that in mind, you have to think about where you have to put it. Where is that going to be a really big problem? Right? Like you probably don't want that to decline someone's loan or, make some kind of really critical decision. So just thinking about where you can tolerate a little bit of inaccuracy and where accuracy is really critical, I think is the biggest thing.
Great. All right, I know we're coming up on time for the end of our webinar. I want to give Tom the last word if I can. Tom, we are entering sort of a new era of opportunity. There are questions about ROI. You've watched both AI and analytics over these past couple decades sort of have its moment in the sun and then maybe a winter and similar. Where are we heading now? Are we headed for another AI winter because we've misset expectations? Are people sort of responsibly figuring out how to use this stuff and moving forward? What do you see over these next couple of years?
Well, I do think that there will be a bit of a decline in the, amazing level of enthusiasm for generative AI. It's in the Gartner trough of disillusionment already. But I don't see another overall AI winter coming. I think we'll see new forms of AI like agentic, maybe combinations. Some people talk about combining some of the rules-based work that we had back in the 1980s and 90s with some machine learning-oriented approaches because it's more understandable and more predictable. But I think the cow's out of the barn in terms of AI, and we're not going to be able to get it back in.
Well, that's good. Hopefully, we are going to not only keep it out of the barn, but in fact, figure out how to use it most effectively to get the things that we want to get done, as we have in other technological opportunities. So I want to take a moment. Thank you very much to Tom and to Chris and to Berkeley for being with me today for this conversation. I learned a lot. I hope all of you online learned a lot. If we didn't get to your question, we will try to reach out afterwards if you gave us your name with your question to respond. And thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.